The Confession Boot. Chapter 1. Burden of Silence. Father Michael sat in the dim confessional, his heart pounding as the penitent's chilling words echoed in his ears. The wooden booth seemed to close in around him, the air growing thick and heavy with each passing moment. Through the latticed screen, he could make out only the shadowy outline of the confessor, but the man's whispered words painted a vivid and terrifying picture. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," the voice had begun, trembling slightly. "I have not yet committed this sin, but I fear I soon will." What followed was a detailed plan to commit a violent crime against a fellow monk. The confessor spoke of long-harbored resentments, of perceived slights and injustices that had festered over years. He described how he would corner his victim in a secluded part of the monastery, how he had procured a weapon, how he had studied the routines of the other monks to ensure he wouldn't be caught. As the confession drew to a close, Father Michael found himself gripping the edge of his seat, his knuckles white with tension. He struggled to keep his voice steady as he spoke the words of absolution, his mind reeling with the weight of what he had just heard. The penitent slipped away, leaving Father Michael alone with his tumultuous thoughts. He remained seated in the confessional long after the church had emptied, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of ancient wood and the pounding of his own heart. The gravity of the situation bore down on him like a physical weight. He was bound by the sacred seal of confession, sworn to never reveal what he had heard within these walls. And yet, how could he remain silent when he knew of a plot to harm one of his brothers? Father Michael finally emerged from the confessional booth, his legs unsteady beneath him. The church was dark now, lit only by the flickering glow of votive candles. He made his way to the altar, sinking to his knees before the crucifix. "Lord," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "guide me, what am I to do?" No divine answer came. Instead, Father Michael found himself grappling with the very foundations of his faith. The seal of confession was absolute, inviolable. To break it would be to betray not only his vows, but the trust of every penitent who had ever sought absolution. And yet, to remain silent was to potentially condemn an innocent man to violence, perhaps even death. He spent a sleepless night in his sparse cell, pacing back and forth in the narrow space between his bed and desk. The candle on his nightstand burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls as he wrestled with his conscience. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Father Michael came to a decision. He couldn't break his vows, but neither could he stand idly by. He would investigate, discreetly, searching for any clues that might help him identify the potential victim or the perpetrator without breaking the seal of confession. With this resolve, he made his way to the refectory for breakfast. The other monks were already gathered, their quiet conversations filling the air with a low murmur. Father Michael's eyes scanned the room, looking at each face with new scrutiny. His gaze fell on Brother Thomas, a quiet and reclusive monk who sat alone at the end of one of the long tables. Thomas's brow was furrowed, his eyes fixed on his bowl of porridge as if it held the secrets of the universe. Father Michael had always known Thomas to be reserved, but now he couldn't help but wonder if there was something more behind that solemn exterior. As he watched, Father Patrick, the abbot, approached Thomas's table. The older man placed a gentle hand on Thomas's shoulder, leaning down to speak to him in low tones. Thomas nodded, his expression unchanging, and Father Patrick moved on. Father Michael was so engrossed in his observations that he barely noticed when Father Patrick sat down beside him. "You seem troubled, my son," the abbot said, his voice kind but his eyes sharp and assessing. Father Michael started, nearly knocking over his cup of tea. "Forgive me, Father," he said, struggling to compose himself. "I didn't sleep well last night." Father Patrick nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving Michael's face. "The burdens we carry can be heavy indeed," he said. "Remember, Michael, that we are a brotherhood. Whatever weighs on your heart, you need not bear it alone." The words, meant to be comforting, only added to Father Michael's inner turmoil. How could he share this burden when doing so would mean breaking his most sacred vow? "Thank you, Father," he managed to say. I will keep that in mind." After breakfast, Father Michael began his discreet investigation in earnest. He spent the morning in the library, ostensibly researching for an upcoming sermon, but in reality, poring over the monastery's records. He searched for any hint of conflict between the monks, any record of grievances or disciplinary actions that might point to underlying tensions. As the day wore on, he found his attention continually drawn to Brother Thomas. The man spent hours in the scriptorium, bent over ancient texts, his quill scratching steadily across parchment. There was something in the set of his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes, that spoke of a deep-seated pain. Father Michael approached him under the guise of seeking assistance with a particularly difficult passage of Latin. As they spoke, he studied Thomas's face, searching for any sign of the anger or resentment he had heard in the confessor's voice. "Brother Thomas," he said carefully, "I couldn't help but notice you seemed preoccupied at breakfast. Is everything all right?" Thomas's hand stilled on the parchment, a drop of ink blossoming where his quill rested. "All is well, Father," he said, his voice flat. "I simply have much work to do." Before Father Michael could press further, another voice interrupted them. "Father Michael," called Brother Gabriel, his tone sharp. "A word, if you please." Reluctantly, Father Michael left Thomas to his work and followed Gabriel into a quiet corner of the library. The taller monk's green eyes were narrowed with suspicion. "I couldn't help but notice your unusual interest in our brothers today," Gabriel said, his voice low but intense. "Is there something we should know about?" Father Michael felt a flash of panic. Had he been so obvious in his investigations? "Not at all, brother," he said, forcing a smile. "I'm simply trying to be more attentive to the needs of our community." Gabriel's eyes narrowed further, but he nodded curtly and moved away. Father Michael released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He would need to be more careful. As night fell, Father Michael found himself drawn back to the library. The vast room was silent and dark, lit only by the pale moonlight streaming through the high windows. He moved quietly between the shelves, his fingers trailing over the spines of ancient tomes. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he felt compelled to search. Perhaps here, among the accumulated wisdom of centuries, he would find some guidance, some solution to his impossible dilemma. He was so lost in thought that he almost missed the sound of footsteps. Ducking behind a shelf, he peered out to see a hooded figure moving purposefully through the library. The figure paused at a specific shelf, pulled out a book and seemed to be searching for something within its pages. Father Michael's heart raced. Was this the confessor, hiding some evidence of his plans? Or perhaps the intended victim, searching for some means of protection? Without thinking, he stepped out from his hiding place. "Who goes there?" he called, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. The figure whirled around, the book clutched to their chest. In the dim light, Father Michael recognized Brother Gabriel. "Father Michael," Gabriel said, his voice tight with anger, "what are you doing here at this hour?" "I might ask you the same question," Father Michael replied, taking a step closer. Gabriel's eyes darted to the side as if looking for an escape route. "That's none of your concern," he snapped. Father Michael lunged forward, reaching for the book in Gabriel's hands. The two men grappled, their struggle sending several books crashing to the floor. In the scuffle, a folded piece of paper fluttered from between the pages of the book Gabriel had been holding. Both men froze, staring at the letter on the floor between them. Then, moving as one, they both dove for it. Father Michael's fingers closed around the paper, just as Gabriel's fist connected with his jaw. He stumbled back, stars exploding in his vision, but he held tight to the letter. "Brother Gabriel," he gasped, tasting blood in his mouth, "what is the meaning of this?" But Gabriel was already fleeing, his footsteps echoing through the library and fading into the distance. Father Michael slumped against a bookshelf, his heart pounding. With trembling hands he unfolded the letter. As he read, his eyes widened with shock. The letter spoke of long-held grudges, of plans for revenge. but it wasn't written by Brother Thomas as he had begun to suspect. Instead, it was signed by Brother James, a monk Father Michael had barely considered in his investigations. The letter painted a picture of jealousy and resentment, of a rivalry between James and Thomas that had apparently been simmering for years. James wrote of feeling overshadowed, of opportunities denied, of slights both real and imagined. Father Michael's mind raced. This letter didn't match exactly with what he'd heard in confession, but it was too similar to be a coincidence. Had James confided his plans to Gabriel? Was Gabriel trying to protect James, or was he involved in the plot himself? As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Father Michael made his way to the abbot's quarters. He knocked softly, then entered to find Father Patrick already awake and at prayer. "Father," Michael said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and emotion, "I fear we have a serious problem." He handed the letter to Father Patrick, watching as the abbot's face grew grave as he read. When he finished, Patrick looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and determination. "This is troubling indeed," he said. "But Michael, I sense there is more you're not telling me. What has led you to this discovery?" Father Michael felt tears prick at his eyes. How could he explain without breaking his vows? How could he not when so much was at stake? I can't say, Father," he whispered. "Please trust that I have reason to believe this threat is real and immediate." Father Patrick studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well," he said. "We must act, but with caution. False accusations could tear our brotherhood apart." As they began to plan their next steps, Father Michael felt a glimmer of hope. The path ahead was fraught with danger, both spiritual and physical, but he was no longer alone in his knowledge, no longer solely responsible for preventing a terrible crime. Yet as he left the abbot's quarters, the weight of his secret still pressed down upon him. He had taken the first steps towards resolving this crisis, but the hardest choices still lay ahead. As he walked through the quiet halls of the monastery, the first rays of sunlight streaming through the windows, Father Michael sent up a silent prayer for strength, wisdom, and guidance in the difficult days to come. Chapter 2. Unveiling the Conspiracy. Father Michael stood in the monastery's courtyard, watching as Brother Benedict hung colourful banners between the stone columns. The usually serene space was alive with activity as monks bustled about, preparing for the upcoming feast of Saint Benedict. Under normal circumstances, Michael would have found joy in the anticipation of the celebration. Today, however, the festive atmosphere only heightened his sense of dread. "Father Michael," called Brother Benedict from atop his ladder, "is this banner straight?" Michael forced a smile, pushing his worries aside for a moment. "It's perfect, brother. The visitors will be impressed." As Benedict beamed with pride, Michael's mind raced. The feast would draw dozens of visitors to the monastery, pilgrims, church officials, and curious locals alike. It was meant to be a time of reverence and community. Instead, it now loomed as a potential backdrop for violence. He made his way to Father Patrick's office, his footsteps echoing in the stone corridor. The abbot looked up as Michael entered, his lined face creasing with concern. "You look troubled, my son," Patrick said, gesturing for Michael to sit. Michael sank into the chair, feeling the weight of his secret pressing down on him. "Father, I fear the feast may present an opportunity for the crime we discussed." Patrick's eyes narrowed. "Have you learned something new?" "No," Michael admitted, "but the influx of visitors, the chaos of the celebration, it would be the perfect cover for violence." The abbot nodded slowly. "We must remain vigilant then. But remember, Michael, we cannot let fear rule us. This feast is a celebration of our faith, of the very principles that guide us in times of trouble." Michael left the office feeling both comforted and conflicted. Father Patrick's words rang true, and yet the urgency of the situation gnawed at him. As he rounded a corner, lost in thought, he nearly collided with Brother Thomas. Thomas flinched back, his eyes darting nervously. Father Michael," he stammered, I didn't see you there." Michael studied the younger monk's face, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the tension in his jaw. "Brother Thomas," he said carefully, "is everything all right? You seem distressed." Thomas's gaze flickered to the side. "I'm fine," he said too quickly. "Just busy with preparations for the feast." Before Michael could press further, Thomas hurried away, his robes swishing against the stone floor. Michael watched him go, a new suspicion taking root in his mind. As night fell, Michael found himself unable to sleep. He paced the narrow confines of his cell, his mind whirling with possibilities and fears. The candle on his desk guttered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. A sound from the corridor outside his cell made him freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, passed by his door. Then silence. Heart pounding, Michael eased his door open and peered out. The corridor was empty, but at the far end, a cloaked figure disappeared around a corner. Without thinking, Michael followed, his bare feet silent on the cold stone floor. The figure led him to the cloister, where moonlight spilled through the arched windows, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow. Michael pressed himself against a column, watching as the mysterious monk knelt by a rosebush, digging in the soil with urgent movements. Just as Michael was about to step forward, a hand clamped down on his shoulder. He whirled, barely suppressing a cry of alarm. "Father Michael," Brother Gabriel hissed, his green eyes glinting in the moonlight. "What are you doing out here at this hour?" Michael's mind raced. I couldn't sleep," he said. "I thought a walk might clear my head." Gabriel's eyes narrowed. "You seem to be doing a lot of nighttime wandering lately, Father. One might think you were looking for something." The tension between them was palpable. Michael opened his mouth to respond, but a sudden cry from the garden made them both turn. There, sprawled on the ground by the rosebush, lay Brother James. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, his robes torn and dirty. Michael rushed to his side, all thoughts of secrecy forgotten. "Brother James," he called, cradling the injured monk's head. "What happened? Who did this to you?" James's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and filled with pain. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a groan escaped. "Gabriel," Michael ordered, "go fetch Father Patrick and Brother Matthew, quickly." As Gabriel sprinted away, Michael tended to James's wounds as best he could. The monk's breathing was labored, and Michael feared internal injuries. "Hold on, brother," he murmured. "Help is coming." In the chaos that followed, the arrival of Father Patrick, the frantic efforts to stabilize James, the whispered speculations of the gathered monks, Michael felt a crushing weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This was no longer a vague threat. Blood had been spilled on holy ground. As dawn broke, casting pale light over the monastery, Michael found himself in the chapel, kneeling before the altar. His hands, still stained with James's blood, trembled as he clasped them in prayer. "Lord," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion, "I am lost. How can I protect my brothers when I don't know who to trust? How can I prevent more violence when I'm bound by my vows? Please give me a sign, guide my path." But the chapel remained silent, the statues of saints staring down at him with impassive stone eyes. For the first time in his life, Michael felt truly alone in his faith. The day passed in a blur of activity. James was taken to the infirmary, his condition stable but serious. Father Patrick ordered an increase in security measures for the upcoming feast, and through it all, Michael watched his fellow monks with wary eyes, wondering which of them might be harboring violent intentions. It was in this state of heightened alertness that Michael made his crucial mistake. As he helped Brother Thomas arrange books in the library, his frayed nerves and suspicions got the better of him. "Brother Thomas," he said, trying to keep his voice casual, "have you noticed anything unusual lately? Any of our brothers acting strangely?" Thomas's hand froze on the spine of a book. He turned slowly, his face a mask of fear and anger. "What are you implying, Father?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Michael realized his error too late. I'm just concerned given what happened to Brother James," he stammered. But the damage was done. Thomas's eyes hardened and he stepped back from Michael as if he were contagious. "I see," he said coldly. "If you'll excuse me, Father, I have duties to attend to." As Thomas strode away, Michael slumped against the bookshelf, cursing his own carelessness. He had just alerted a potential suspect to his suspicions, potentially jeopardizing the entire investigation. That night, as Michael lay in his cell, trying to quiet his racing thoughts, strange occurrences began to plague him. First, the heavy wooden door of his cell slammed shut with a thunderous bang, startling him from his fitful sleep. Heart pounding, he lit a candle, only to watch in bewilderment as the flame flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. From somewhere in the monastery came the sound of the watchdog's bark, cut suddenly and ominously short. Michael huddled in his bed, every creak and groan of the ancient building setting his nerves on edge. When morning finally came, Michael emerged from his cell feeling haggard and on edge. The strange events of the night had left him feeling vulnerable and exposed. As he made his way to the chapel for morning prayers, he couldn't shake the feeling that unseen eyes were watching his every move. It was in this state of heightened paranoia that Michael descended into the crypt later that day. The cool, musty air enveloped him as he moved between the ancient tombs, his candle casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. He had come seeking solitude, a place to gather his thoughts away from the bustle of the monastery above. Instead, he found Brother Andrew, hunched over an open sarcophagus, frantically shoving a bundle of papers behind the desiccated remains within. "Brother Andrew," Michael called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "What are you doing?" Andrew whirled around, his face a mask of panic and guilt. "Father Michael, I was just—" But Michael was already striding forward, reaching for the incriminating documents. Andrew's eyes darted wildly, and then, with a snarl of desperation, he lunged at Michael. The two men grappled in the narrow space between the tombs, their shadows dancing grotesquely on the walls. Michael felt Andrew's fist connect with his jaw, sending him staggering back against a stone effigy. Pain exploded in his head, but he forced himself to focus, to remember his purpose. With a surge of strength, Michael pushed forward, tackling Andrew to the ground. They rolled across the cold stone floor, each fighting for control. Michael's hand closed around the bundle of papers, but Andrew refused to let go. "Stop this madness, brother," Michael gasped, struggling to pin Andrew down. "Whatever you're hiding, it's not worth this." But Andrew's eyes were wild with fear and desperation. He thrashed beneath Michael, his elbow catching the priest in the ribs. Michael's breath left him in a whoosh, and Andrew seized the opportunity to scramble away. For a moment, they faced each other in the flickering candlelight, both panting heavily. Then, with a look of utter defeat, Andrew slumped against a tomb. "It's over," he whispered. "It's all over." With trembling hands, Michael unfolded the crumpled documents. As he read, his eyes widened with shock and dismay. Letters, notes, records of clandestine meetings, all pointing to a web of deceit and manipulation that stretched back years. And at the center of it all, a name that made Michael's blood run cold. Brother Thomas. "He's being blackmailed," Andrew said, his voice hollow. I've been helping him, keeping his secret. But it's gone too far, Father. I never meant for anyone to get hurt." Michael's mind raced, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Thomas's reclusiveness, his nervous behavior, the glimpses of fear in his eyes. It all made sense now. "What secret?" Michael asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. What could be so terrible that it would drive Thomas to consider violence? Andrew shook his head. "It's not my place to say, Father, but you need to talk to Thomas, before it's too late." As they emerged from the crypt, blinking in the sudden sunlight, Michael felt a renewed sense of purpose. The mystery was far from solved, but he had a direction now, a path to follow. He found Thomas in the monastery garden, methodically pruning a rose bush. The younger monk tensed as Michael approached, his eyes darting nervously to the side. "Brother Thomas," Michael said gently, "we need to talk." Thomas's shoulders slumped, as if a great weight had settled upon them. "You know, don't you?" he whispered. Michael nodded, his heart heavy with compassion for the troubled monk before him. "I know you're being blackmailed, Thomas. I know you're scared. But whatever you're hiding, whatever mistake you've made, it's not worth destroying your life over." Tears welled up in Thomas's eyes. "You don't understand, Father. If the truth comes out, I'll lose everything. My place here, my vocation, my entire life." "Tell me," Michael urged. "Let me help you." And so, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the garden in hues of gold and crimson, Thomas poured out his story. He spoke of a youthful indiscretion, a moment of weakness that had haunted him for years, of Brother Andrew discovering his secret and using it to manipulate him, forcing him to participate in schemes that went against everything he believed in. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," Thomas said, his voice choked with emotion. "But Andrew, he said if I didn't go along with his plan, he'd expose me. I'd lose everything I've worked for, everything I believe in." Michael listened, his heart aching for the young monk. When Thomas finished, Michael placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone in this anymore, Thomas," he said firmly. "We'll find a way through this together." As they sat in the gathering twilight, Michael's mind was already racing, formulating a plan. They would need evidence, witnesses. They would need to move carefully to avoid tipping off Andrew or any other conspirators. But most of all, they would need faith. Faith in each other, faith in the truth, and faith that even in the darkest of times, light could prevail. As the bells rang out for evening prayers, Michael and Thomas rose, their faces set with determination. The feast of St. Benedict was fast approaching, and with it, the potential for both disaster and redemption. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Michael knew one thing for certain: he was no longer alone in his struggle. And in that knowledge he found a glimmer of hope, a spark of the divine that would light their way through the darkness to come. Chapter 3. Shadows in the Tower. The pre-dawn chill seeped through the stone walls of St. Augustine Monastery as Father Michael rose from his restless slumber. The feast of St. Benedict loomed large, casting a shadow over what should have been a joyous occasion. As he donned his robes in the dim light of his cell, Michael's fingers brushed against something unexpected, a crumpled piece of paper tucked into one of the pockets. His heart racing, Michael smoothed out the note, squinting to read the elegant yet hurried script in the faint light. The words sent a chill down his spine. "The hour of reckoning approaches. When the bells toll for Benedict, blood will be spilled." Michael's hands trembled as he refolded the note. The threat he had been investigating, the danger he had hoped to prevent, was no longer a vague possibility. It was imminent, set to unfold during the very celebration they had all been preparing for. As he made his way through the silent corridors to begin his morning duties, Michael's mind whirled with possibilities. Who had slipped the note into his robes? Was it a warning from an ally or a taunt from the perpetrator? And how could he possibly hope to prevent a crime when he didn't know the target, the method, or even the true motive? The monastery came to life around him, monks emerging from their cells to prepare for the day's festivities. Michael watched them with new eyes, scrutinizing every interaction, every whispered conversation. Brother Thomas, still bearing the weight of his secret, avoided Michael's gaze as they passed in the refectory. Brother Gabriel's piercing green eyes seemed to follow Michael's every move, while Brother Andrew's perpetually worried expression now seemed tinged with something darker, guilt perhaps, or fear. Even the familiar rituals of prayer and meditation offered Michael no solace. As he knelt in the chapel, the words of the Psalms tangled on his tongue, his mind unable to focus on anything but the impending threat. The very air seemed thick with tension, the usually comforting scent of incense now cloying and oppressive. As the morning wore on, Michael found himself drawn to Father Patrick's office. The abbot had been his confidant throughout this ordeal, offering guidance and support. Perhaps together they could formulate a plan to protect the monastery and its inhabitants. But as Michael approached the heavy oak door, he hesitated. A nagging doubt gnawed at him. a suspicion he had been trying to ignore. Father Patrick's calm in the face of danger, his vague yet pointed advice, could it be that the abbot knew more than he was letting on? Steeling himself, Michael eased the door open, relieved to find the office empty. He moved quickly, his eyes scanning the bookshelves, the desk, searching for anything out of place. It was then that he noticed it, a slight unevenness in the paneling behind one of the shelves. His heart pounding, Michael carefully shifted the books aside, revealing a hidden drawer. Inside lay a single document, its parchment crisp and official, bearing the unmistakable seal of the abbot. As Michael's eyes raced over the contents, his blood ran cold. The document detailed plans for the monastery, financial records, personnel decisions, even potential scandals, information that should have been known only to Father Patrick himself. And yet, here it was, hidden away like a guilty secret. The implications were staggering. If this document had fallen into the wrong hands, it could be used to blackmail not just individual monks, but the entire monastery. And who but the abbot himself would have access to such sensitive information? Michael's mind reeled as the pieces began to fall into place. The vague warnings, the convenient appearances at crucial moments. Had Father Patrick been manipulating events all along? Was he the mastermind behind the plot that had thrown the monastery into chaos? Footsteps in the corridor jolted Michael back to reality. He quickly replaced the document and rearranged the books, slipping out of the office just as Brother Gabriel rounded the corner. The suspicious monk's eyes narrowed, but Michael forced a calm nod as he passed. As the day wore on and preparations for the feast reached a fever pitch, Michael's anxiety grew. He knew he had to confront Father Patrick, but the thought of accusing his mentor, the man he had trusted above all others, filled him with dread. It was nearing twilight when Michael finally spotted the abbot, alone in the bell tower, overseeing the final preparations. Taking a deep breath, Michael climbed the winding stairs, the document he had discovered clutched in his trembling hand. "Father Patrick," he called out as he reached the top, "we need to talk." The abbot turned, his face a mask of calm concern. "Michael, my son, what troubles you on this blessed day?" Michael held out the document, his voice steadier than he felt. "I found this in your office, hidden. Can you explain why such sensitive information was concealed?" For a moment, something flickered in Father Patrick's eyes. Surprise? Anger? But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a benevolent smile. "My dear Michael, surely you understand the need for discretion in matters of the church. Some information must be protected, even from our own brothers." But Michael wasn't swayed. "And the threats, the violence, the fear that has gripped our community? Was that all for the sake of discretion as well?" Father Patrick's smile faded, his eyes hardening. "You overstep, Michael. Your zeal in this matter has clouded your judgment. Perhaps it would be best if you retired to your cell for the remainder of the evening." As the abbot reached out, presumably to take the document, Michael stepped back. "No," he said, his voice firm. "I can't ignore this. Too much is at stake." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Father Patrick lunged forward, his hand no longer reaching for the document, but for Michael's throat. Michael stumbled back, his heel catching on the uneven stone floor. As he fell, he saw a glint of metal in the abbot's other hand, a knife, pulled from within the folds of his robes. Instinct took over. Michael rolled to the side, feeling the whisper of the blade as it sliced through the air where he had been. He scrambled to his feet, adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Father, please," he gasped. "This isn't the way." But the man before him was no longer the wise, benevolent leader Michael had known. Father Patrick's face was contorted with rage, his eyes wild as he advanced. "You fool," he snarled. "You have no idea what's truly at stake here." They grappled in the confined space of the bell tower, the document forgotten as they fought for control of the knife. Michael's back slammed against the stone wall, knocking the breath from his lungs. He felt the cold edge of the blade press against his throat, saw the triumph in Father Patrick's eyes. In that moment, with death a hair's breadth away, Michael's mind cleared. He remembered the hidden mechanism in the tower, a relic from times when the monastery needed to defend itself from outside threats. With a desperate surge of strength, he pushed Father Patrick back just far enough to reach the concealed lever. The sound of grinding stone filled the air as the entrance to the bell tower sealed itself, trapping both men inside. Father Patrick's eyes widened in shock, then narrowed in fury. "What have you done?" he hissed. Michael, panting heavily, managed to put some distance between them. "Ended this," he said. "Help will come. The truth will be known. It's over, Father." For a long moment, the only sound was their ragged breathing and the distant tolling of the bells. Then, to Michael's astonishment, Father Patrick began to laugh. It was a low, mirthless sound that sent chills down Michael's spine. "Oh, my dear misguided Michael," the abbot said, lowering the knife, "you've played your part perfectly, exactly as I knew you would." Confusion and dread warred in Michael's mind. "What are you talking about?" Father Patrick's smile was cold, calculating. "Did you really think I would leave such an important document where it could be so easily found, that I would resort to violence over mere blackmail material?" He shook his head almost pityingly. "No, Michael, this was all a test." The words hit Michael like a physical blow. "A test," he repeated, disbelief coloring his voice. "The monastery needs a leader who can face any challenge," Father Patrick explained, his tone maddeningly calm. "One who can make difficult decisions, who can navigate the complex moral landscape of our calling. I needed to know if you were that leader." Michael's mind reeled as he processed the implications. The threats, Brother James's injury, the fear that has gripped our entire community. All of that was just a game to you? Father Patrick's eyes hardened. "Not a game, Michael. A crucible. And you have emerged stronger for it. You have proven your worth, your dedication to the truth and to the protection of our brothers." But Michael felt no sense of triumph, no pride in having passed this twisted test. Instead, a deep, burning anger began to well up within him. "You had no right," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "No right to manipulate us, to put lives at risk for your experiment." Before Father Patrick could respond, the sound of pounding fists on stone echoed through the tower. "Father Michael, Father Patrick," Brother Thomas's voice called out, tinged with panic. "Are you in there? What's happened?" Michael met Father Patrick's gaze, seeing the challenge there. In that moment, he knew that the true test was not over. How he handled this revelation, how he led the monastery forward from this point, would determine far more than Father Patrick's cruel machinations ever could. "We're here," Michael called back, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "We're unharmed, but the door is sealed. You'll need to force it open." As the sounds of the monks' efforts to break through filled the air, Michael turned back to Father Patrick. "You will answer for this," he said quietly, "to the brothers, to the church, and to God." Father Patrick's smile never wavered. "As will you, my son, as will you." The door burst open with a shower of stone and dust. Brother Thomas and Brother Stephen rushed in, followed by a group of wide-eyed monks. They froze at the scene before them, Father Michael standing tall, Father Patrick kneeling with a knife at his feet. In the stunned silence that followed, Michael's voice rang out clear and strong. "Brothers, there is much you need to know. Our faith, our trust, and our very purpose have been tested today. But from this trial we will emerge stronger, more united in our devotion to God and to each other." As he began to explain, Michael felt the weight of leadership settle upon his shoulders. The path ahead would be difficult, fraught with challenges both spiritual and earthly. But as he looked into the faces of his brothers, saw the trust and hope in their eyes, he knew that he was ready to face whatever lay ahead. The feast of St. Benedict proceeded that evening, a subdued affair tinged with confusion and whispered speculation. Father Patrick was placed under house arrest, pending a full investigation by the church authorities. And through it all, Father Michael moved among the monks and visitors, offering comfort, guidance, and a steadying presence. As the last echoes of the feast faded and the monastery settled into an uneasy quiet, Michael found himself drawn to the chapel. He knelt before the altar, the events of the day playing over and over in his mind. His faith had been tested, pushed to its very limits. He had faced violence, betrayal, and moral quandaries that would have broken a lesser man, and yet, here he stood, battered but unbroken, his convictions stronger than ever. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the stained glass windows, painting the chapel in hues of gold and crimson, Father Michael rose to his feet. He had been forged in fire, tempered by trial. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with courage, compassion, and an unwavering faith in the power of truth and redemption. The bells of St. Augustine Monastery began to toll, calling the brothers to morning prayer. And as Father Michael stepped forward to lead the congregation, he knew that this was not an end, but a beginning, a new chapter in the life of the monastery and in his own journey of faith. The echoes of the bells faded, and in the reverent silence that followed, Father Michael's voice rose clear and strong, leading his flock forward into the light of a new day. Chapter 4. A Faith Reclaimed. Father Michael sat in his modest cell, the walls feeling closer and more oppressive than ever before. The weight of betrayal by Father Patrick and the staged plot overwhelmed him. He clutched his rosary, the smooth beads sliding through his fingers, but instead of finding solace, he felt a hollow emptiness. The monastery, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. His piercing blue eyes, usually alight with compassion and faith, now reflected only turmoil and doubt. The decision to abandon his faith and leave the monastery began to crystallize in his mind. It was a thought that, just days ago, would have been unthinkable. But now, as the full extent of the deception unfolded, it seemed like the only path forward. Michael's gaze fell on the simple wooden cross hanging on his wall. It had been a gift from Father Patrick when he first arrived at St. Augustine's over 2 decades ago. The memory of that day, once cherished, now felt tainted. He rose from his bed, his movements slow and deliberate, and began to pack his few personal belongings. Each item he placed in his small bag felt like a piece of his identity being stripped away. His Bible, worn and annotated, a testament to years of study and devotion. A photo of his family, taken before he answered his calling. A letter from a parishioner, thanking him for his guidance during a difficult time. These tangible reminders of his life's work now seemed to mock him. As he reached for the cross on the wall, his hand trembled. For a moment he hesitated, memories flooding back. The joy of his ordination, the quiet satisfaction of helping others find their way, the sense of belonging he had found within these walls. Each step towards the door felt like a step away from a part of himself, yet the sense of betrayal made it feel inevitable. But even as he prepared to leave, a nagging thought tugged at him. He couldn't go without confronting Father Patrick one last time. He needed answers, needed to understand how the man he had looked up to for so long could have orchestrated such an elaborate deception. With a heavy heart, Michael made his way through the familiar corridors of the monastery. The stone walls, usually a source of comfort, now seemed to loom over him accusingly. He passed Brother Thomas in the hallway, the younger monk's eyes darting away guiltily. Michael felt a pang of sympathy mixed with disappointment. How many others had been caught up in this web of lies? He found Father Patrick in the abbot's study, surrounded by ancient books and symbols of their faith. The older man looked up as Michael entered, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and resignation. For a moment neither spoke, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy between them. "Why?" Michael finally broke the silence, his voice cracking with emotion. "How could you do this to me, to the brothers, to everything we stand for?" Father Patrick sighed heavily, gesturing for Michael to sit. "My son," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "I know you're hurting. I know you feel betrayed, but please hear me out before you make any decisions you might regret." Michael reluctantly took a seat, his body tense, ready to flee at any moment. Father Patrick leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Michael's face. "I've watched you struggle with your faith for some time now. the abbot began. "I've seen the doubt in your eyes, the questions you were afraid to ask. I still believe, that only by facing extreme challenges could you reaffirm your dedication and truly understand the depths of your faith." Michael listened, his emotions warring within him. Part of him wanted to lash out, to reject every word as just another manipulation. But another part, the part that had always looked up to Father Patrick, urged him to listen. "My methods were unorthodox, I admit," Patrick continued, "perhaps even wrong. But my intentions were pure. I wanted to forge you into the leader this monastery needs, the leader I know you can be." As Father Patrick spoke, the door to the study opened. Brother Thomas entered, followed by Brother James and several other monks. Each wore an expression of guilt and apprehension. "Father Michael," Thomas began, his voice barely above a whisper, We all played a part in this. We were convinced by Father Patrick's vision, by the idea that we were helping you find your true path." One by one, the monks confessed their roles in the staged plot. Some had personal grievances that made them easy to manipulate. Others truly believed they were doing the right thing. Their confessions added layers to the complex web of deceit, leaving Michael feeling a mix of betrayal and sympathy. As the revelations unfolded, Michael's mind raced to piece together the entire scheme. The strange occurrences, the injuries, the whispered conversations, all of it had been carefully orchestrated. The depth of the manipulation was staggering, and Michael's heart ached at the thought of how easily his faith had been tested. Yet, as he listened to the confessions and explanations, something unexpected began to stir within him. The anger and betrayal were still there, but alongside them grew a newfound determination. He had been tested, pushed to his limits, and he had survived. His faith, though shaken, had not been broken. As the monks finished their confessions, a new figure entered the room. Brother Stephen, a monk who had always seemed supportive and uninvolved in the recent turmoil, stepped forward. His demeanor was calm, almost too calm given the charged atmosphere in the room. Michael's eyes narrowed as he studied Stephen. In the clarity that comes with revelation, he began to notice subtle inconsistencies in Stephen's statements and actions over the past weeks. The way he had always been present during key moments, how he had subtly encouraged Michael's doubts while appearing to offer support. "Brother Stephen," Michael said, his voice low and controlled, "you've been unusually quiet throughout all of this. Is there something you'd like to add?" Stephen's calm facade cracked for just a moment, a flicker of surprise and guilt crossing his face before he regained his composure. I don't know what you mean, Father Michael. I've only tried to be supportive during these difficult times." But Michael pressed further, his investigative instincts honed by weeks of uncertainty and suspicion. "You've been manipulating events behind the scenes, haven't you? Pushing me further, relishing the chaos it caused. Why?" Under the weight of Michael's scrutiny and the shocked gazes of the other monks, Stephen's composure finally crumbled. "You don't understand," he said, his voice bitter. "None of you do. I've watched for years as this monastery stagnated, as we clung to outdated traditions and ignored the real problems in the world outside our walls." Stephen's confession poured out, a torrent of resentment and frustrated idealism. He spoke of his own crisis of faith, of feeling trapped within the monastery's hierarchy. He admitted to orchestrating certain events to push Michael over the edge, hoping it would expose the frailties within the monastery's leadership and force changes. As Stephen's words faded into a tense silence, Michael found himself at a crossroad. The betrayal he felt was profound, reaching to the very core of his being. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away, to leave behind this place of deception and manipulation. And yet, as he looked around the room at the faces of the monks he had lived and worked alongside for so many years, Michael felt something shift within him. He saw not just the betrayal but the humanity behind it, the fear, the misguided good intentions, the desperate search for meaning that had driven them all to this point. In that moment, Michael realized that leaving the monastery would mean abandoning not only his faith, but also the very people who needed guidance and compassion the most. The challenges he had faced had not broken him. They had revealed the true strength of his convictions. "I will stay," Michael said, his voice quiet but firm. The words surprised even him as they left his mouth, but he knew they were right. "Not because I forgive what has been done, but because there is work to be done here. We have all lost our way, and we must find it together." The room erupted in a mixture of relief, gratitude, and lingering tension. Father Patrick stepped forward, tears in his eyes. "Michael, my son, But Michael held up a hand, silencing him. "No more, Father. What's done is done. Now we must face the consequences and rebuild what has been broken." With that, Michael turned and left the study, his steps purposeful. He made his way to the chapel, needing a moment of solitude to process all that had happened. As he knelt before the altar, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The betrayal still stung, the road ahead would be difficult, but he was no longer lost. He prayed, not with the desperate fervor of recent days, but with a calm certainty. He prayed for guidance, for strength, and for the wisdom to lead his troubled flock. As he rose, he felt a renewed connection to his faith, deeper and more profound than ever before. The next evening, as the feast of St. Benedict began, Father Michael stood before the gathered monks. The atmosphere was tense, the recent revelations hanging heavy in the air. But as Michael began to speak, a hush fell over the assembly. His homily was unlike any he had given before. He spoke of faith tested by fire, of dedication forged in adversity. He didn't shy away from the recent turmoil, but used it as a powerful metaphor for the challenges all must face in their spiritual journey. "We have all been tested," he said, his voice ringing clear through the hall. "We have all in our own ways fallen short. But it is not in our perfection that we find grace, but in our willingness to rise again after we fall." As he spoke, Michael could see the impact of his words on the faces before him. There was shame, yes, but also hope. A renewed sense of purpose began to kindle in eyes that had been clouded with doubt and fear. "Our faith is not a shield against hardship," Michael continued, his voice growing stronger. "It is the strength that allows us to face those hardships and emerge stronger. We have been shaken, brothers, but we have not been broken." As he neared the end of his homily, Michael paused, looking out over the sea of faces. He saw Father Patrick, his expression a mixture of pride and remorse. He saw Brother Thomas, tears streaming down his face. He saw Brother Stephen, his head bowed in reflection. "In the darkest trials," Michael said, his voice filled with conviction, "we find the brightest truths. Let us move forward together, not in spite of our struggles, but because of them. Let us build a stronger faith, a more compassionate brotherhood, and a deeper understanding of what it truly means to serve God and each other." As the last words echoed through the hall, a profound silence fell. Then slowly a murmur of agreement began to build. Monks turned to one another, clasping hands, offering words of support and reconciliation. Michael stepped down from the pulpit, feeling both exhausted and exhilarated. He knew that this was just the beginning, that there would be many challenges ahead. The trust that had been broken would not be easily repaired. The questions raised by their ordeal would not be quickly answered. But as he looked out over his flock, seeing the renewed sense of purpose in their eyes, Michael felt a surge of hope. They had been through the fire together, and they had emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. In the days that followed, the monastery began the slow process of healing. Father Patrick, though still respected for his years of service, stepped down from his position as abbot. A council was formed to address the issues that had been brought to light, with Michael playing a key role in guiding the discussions. Brother Stephen, after much soul-searching, chose to leave the monastery to pursue his desire for more active engagement with the outside world. Michael, despite the pain Stephen had caused, found it in his heart to wish him well and to acknowledge the valid points he had raised about the monastery's role in the wider community. As for Michael himself, he found that his faith, far from being destroyed by the ordeal, had been tempered and strengthened. He approached his duties with a new wisdom, a deeper empathy for the struggles of others, and a more nuanced understanding of the complexities of faith and human nature. One evening, as the sun set over the monastery grounds, Michael stood in the chapel, gazing up at the crucifix. The doubts and fears that had plagued him seemed distant now, replaced by a quiet certainty. He knew that there would be more challenges ahead, more moments of doubt and difficulty, but he also knew that he was ready to face them. "In the darkest trials we find the brightest truths," he whispered to himself, a small smile playing on his lips. The words were no longer just a platitude, but a lived experience, a hard-won wisdom that would guide him in the days to come. As he turned to leave the chapel, Michael caught sight of his reflection in a polished silver candlestick. The face that looked back at him was older, lined with the cares of recent weeks, but also somehow younger, alight with renewed purpose and faith. He was no longer the same man who had entered the confessional booth all those weeks ago, burdened by a terrible secret. He was no longer the man who had nearly abandoned his calling in a moment of despair. He was someone new, forged in the crucible of trial and emerging stronger for it. With a final glance at the crucifix, Michael stepped out of the chapel and into the cool evening air. The monastery lay before him, its ancient stones bathed in the golden light of sunset. It was no longer a place of secrets and shadows, but a place of potential, of growth, of renewed faith. As he walked back to his cell, Michael felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The journey ahead would not be easy, but he was ready to face it. With each step, he reaffirmed his commitment to his faith, to his brothers, and to the path he had chosen. The bells of St. Augustine's began to toll, calling the monks to evening prayer. Michael quickened his pace, ready to join his brothers in worship. As he entered the church, he saw the faces turn towards him, filled with respect, trust, and a shared sense of purpose. In that moment, Michael knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The trials of recent weeks had not broken him or his faith. They had revealed its true strength, its resilience, its power to transform and renew. As he took his place among the monks, his voice joining theirs in prayer, Michael felt a surge of gratitude for the challenges that had tested him, for the brothers who surrounded him, and for the faith that had seen him through his darkest hour. The final notes of the prayer faded away, leaving a profound silence in their wake. In that silence, Michael found not emptiness but possibility. The story of St. Augustine's was far from over. A new chapter was beginning, and he was ready to help write it.